Thank you. My first guest tonight is the Urban Infrastructure Minister, Paul Fletcher. Paul Fletcher, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Patricia.
Firstly, on this announcement today, asylum seekers who arrive by boat face a lifetime ban from Australia, even if they are found to be genuine refugees. Now, these laws are retrospective. They're going to be introduced to Parliament next week. Even those who have returned to their home countries will be unable to return, even as a tourist. This is an extremely hard line. Why is it even necessary?
Well, this is about sending a very clear message to the criminal gangs which operate people smuggling operations. Now, it's been the position for some time. In fact, the position was first introduced by Kevin Rudd as Labor Prime Minister in July 2013. And he said, as of today, asylum seekers who come here by boat without a visa will never be settled in Australia. So that was a position that Labor took to the 2013 election. Of course, the coalition, since we came to power in 2013, has been busy cleaning up the terrible mess we were left by Labor, with some 1,200 deaths at sea during the Rudd-Gillard years.
OK, but to be clear, you haven't introduced these laws any earlier, and yet none of these asylum seekers are in Australia. It seems like a pretty blatant wedge to me. Isn't that what this is, politics? Because these people aren't in Australia. You've said they're not coming to Australia. Why a lifetime ban? Why is these laws necessary now?
Well, as Prime Minister Turnbull and the Minister Dutton said today, what we've been working through is a steady process of cleaning up the extraordinary mess we were left by Labor. We've closed 17 detention centres. There are now no children in detention, and there are we're seeing a significant number of people on Nauru, for example, who are employed or who are operating small businesses. So we've been working through cleaning up the mess that we inherited from Labor. This is about taking a further step to send a very clear message to the criminal people smuggling gangs. We saw...
were you under the impression that they weren't clear on this? Because I would have thought it was crystal clear. These asylum seekers have been in offshore detention in what seems like an extraordinarily long time now, and yet these laws now, it seems like there's a political motivation to these laws, given we haven't needed them till this point.
Well, this is about sending a very, very clear message to the criminal people smuggling gangs. We do need to maintain a strong set of borders. Of course, as a consequence of the things we've been able to do, we've also been able to increase the number of places for refugees, people coming from UN High Commission for Refugee camps and so on, up to 18,750 places. We've been able to provide 12,000 places for victims of the conflict in Syria and Iraq. And these are all things that we can do because we have maintained strong borders. Now, we had to work very hard to turn around the mess we inherited from the Labor Party. In 2013, Labor is under the returned Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, adopted a position which we have maintained since then. And we certainly would expect that Labor will support this legislation, which is consistent with the position that Kevin Rudd took to the election.
Isn't Labor entitled to look very carefully at this move, given Labor has had a bipartisan support for your policy and Labor's original policy of these people not coming to Australia, and yet you seem to be trying to do something new now by enshrining something in law which is permanent, which affects a group of people in a way which doesn't even let them visit Australia at any point in their future, even if they're able to start a life somewhere else, like in Cambodia, and they just want to come on a tourist visa at some point. I mean, it seems extremely draconian. Why shouldn't Labor be given the time to consider this properly?
Well, we certainly would expect and hope for the support of the Labor Party in this measure, which is designed to maintain our strong borders. Now, since the coalition has been in power, there have been no successful boat arrivals, but it is important to maintain a position of vigilance, and so we certainly would expect and hope that Labor would support these measures, these amendments to the Migration Act, which were announced today by the Prime Minister and the Immigration Minister.
Just on another issue, figures confirmed at a Senate Estimates Committee hearings last week show that in the 2015-16 financial year, the government invested $5.5 billion on transport infrastructure, and that's about, I think it's around $2.5 billion less than the $8 billion you promised in the 2014 budget. You talk big on infrastructure, but you're not even spending the money you said you would spend. Why is this happening?
Well, let me just be clear. The Coalition is spending considerably more on infrastructure than was spent under the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government. In fact, in the first, if you compare
Sure, but you're not spending what you said you would spend. The question is about what you said you would spend.
I'll come to that in a second. This is an important point. In the first three budgets of this government, of the Coalition government, compared to the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, if you look at the amount we're spending, it's more than 40% more than Labor was spending. Now, across the country, we are spending very substantial amounts, $5.6 billion, so that the Pacific Highway will be 4 lanes from Sydney to the Queensland border by 2020. The commitment of over $7 billion on the Bruce Highway, the Toowoomba Second Range Crossing, the Gateway North upgrade in Brisbane, the Sydney Metro project, $1.7 billion towards that transformational
sure, but I'm talking
rail
about
project.
You're not spending the money you said you would spend. That's the question.
We are consistently spending large amounts of money. Now, of course, there are always variations between what is in effectively the forecast. So this is a forecast or an estimate that was in the May 2014 budget, and we now have the final position as to what was spent in 2015-16. These variations occur from time to time. We saw a variation of a similar magnitude.
It's a significant variation.
In the 2012-13 budget. But the point I'm making is there is record infrastructure spending under the Turnbull government, some $50 billion between now and 2019-20. I could point to WestConnex, $16.8 billion, of which there's $2 billion of concessional loan money and $1.5 billion of Commonwealth grant money. NorthConnex with $412 million of Commonwealth grant money. In Victoria, you've got the Tullamarine freeway widening, the M80 Ring Road, and we announced a $1.5 billion Victorian infrastructure package in April this year.
But you concede you are spending less than what's in the you are spending less than what's in the budget.
In terms of the particular comparison for that period, yes, but in those spending commitments remain. I hasten to add a significant driver there is that relevant line item is entitled infrastructure payments to support states. So if a state chooses to delay the commencement of a project by 6 months, for example, it can slip into a subsequent year. That's happened in relation to a number of elements. One of the other things that's happened here, I might say, is we're getting some significant savings on projects. On the Toowoomba Second Range Crossing, for example, savings of about $150 million are presently expected. On the Bruce Highway, very significant savings. Now, coming from a business background, in my view, in the Coalition's view, when the budget amount turns out when you need to spend less than the budget amount to get the same outcome, that's a good thing. In the topsy-turvy world of Labor, for some reason that's a bad thing. But we're interested in outcomes. We are spending record amounts on infrastructure. There's an extraordinary range of infrastructure projects all around the country. In Adelaide, for example, the Northern Connector. In Perth, we've committed over $1 billion to Perth Freight Link. All around the country. Inland Rail, for example, we've committed nearly $900 million to Inland Rail. So in our big cities, in regional Australia, record amounts of infrastructure spending under the Turnbull government. This is transformational spending.
All right. Just on another issue on housing, John Alexander has backed some comments that have come out of New South Wales about looking at that ACT model for housing where you get rid of stamp duty and look at something called, a land tax version instead. Now, John Alexander says we need to be having this conversation. Is the government prepared to do more than just talk about supply and pushing it off into the never, but actually talking about something tangible? I mean, is John Alexander right that it's worth looking at these kinds of ideas?
Well, look, Scott Morrison gave an excellent speech this week highlighting some of the issues in terms of housing affordability. He made the point there's been a drop over the last few years from 71% of Australian households either owning a house outright or in the process of buying it through a mortgage. That's dropped to 67%. he pointed to the challenge in assembling a deposit. So these are important issues, and he made the point that one of the issues we really need to address is the supply side constraints, getting more property coming into the market. And that doesn't just mean in the outer suburbs, it also means throughout our cities. In New South Wales, for example, we've seen a really good initiative from Planning Minister Rob Stokes, which is looking at changing the planning rules to increase the number of terrace houses in middle ring suburbs. These are a popular form of housing, but they're undersupplied compared to demand. He made the point actually that even on the present zoning rules, you could have a couple of 100,000 more terraces in the middle ring suburbs in Sydney. So look, this is an important issue, a very important speech from
But does
Treasurer
John
Scott.
Alexander have a point? That was my question.
Well, look,
we need to look at those sorts of proposals.
So in terms of the question of stamp duty versus land tax, that really is a matter for state governments. Now, Premier Baird this week indicated that he didn't have a great appetite from a New South Wales perspective for looking at that sort of transformation. But what I think is terrific is that Treasurer Morrison has kicked off a really good discussion of an important issue, and he's indicated a focus from the Turnbull government, and particularly in working with state governments, to encourage the provision of extra supply of housing so that we can get more supply coming into the market. That's a really important factor.
Many thanks for your time this evening.
Thanks, Patricia.